Good evening. I would like to welcome you to this evening to the Fall 2024 Gale Family Foundation Lecture. My name is Jonathan Kaplan, and I am the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. I begin this evening by extending my thanks to the sponsor of tonight's event, the Gale Family Foundation. Along with the Schusterman Family Philanthropies, the Gale Family Foundation's sustained support of Jewish studies at UT Austin has ensured the success of the program and has enabled the Schusterman Center to be a pioneer in the field. The Gale Family Foundation Annual Lecture Series is an event that predates and helped to sow the seeds for the establishment of a Center of Jewish Studies here at UT. This lecture series has brought leading scholars in Jewish studies, commentators, writers, and artists to the 40 acres. These lectures introduce undergraduate and graduate students, faculty from across campus, and broad off-campus audiences to the world of Jewish studies, to Jewish arts and culture, and to critical thought on pressing contemporary issues. Most recently, Doris Bergen, Oded Lipschitz, Susanna Heschel, and Sidra Dekova-Mizrahi have been Gale lecturers. Along with the lecture series, the Gale Family Foundation has helped to support one of the main programmatic and research focuses of the center, Jewish life in the Americas, through endowments in Judaic studies, Jewish arts and culture, and North American Jewish life. The Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas is a research consortium directed by my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, that facilitates shared projects for scholars from Canada, the United States, Mexico, Argentina, and Israel. I would like to thank the staff at the Schusterman Center, Administrative Associate Emily Petrovsky, and our student assistant Angela Bakaisa for their work on tonight's event. I would also like to thank those helping us put on this event tonight here at the Texas Union and the Liberal Arts ITS. When you entered this evening, you were all given an index card and a pencil. Please use these to write questions down that you have for our speaker. If you need more, there's some at the table at the back. We will collect them at the end of the lecture, and I will curate them and pose them to tonight's lecture. Our speaker for this evening, Samuel Freedman, is an award-winning author, columnist, professor, and wonderful human being. A former columnist for the New York Times and a professor at Columbia University for just a little while longer, he is the author of 10 acclaimed books. The most recent of them, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey, and The Fight for Civil Rights. One of Freedman's previous books, Jew versus Jew, perhaps you know it, won the National Jewish Book Award for nonfiction in 2001. And a result of the book, Freedman was named one of the Forward 50 most important American Jews in the year 2000 by the weekly Jewish newspaper, The Forward. A tenured professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, Freedman was named the nation's outstanding journalism educator in 1997 by the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2012, he received Columbia University's coveted Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching. Freedman's class in book writing has developed more than 110 authors, editors, and agents, and it has been featured in Publishers Weekly and the Christian Science Monitor. He's a board member of the J. Anthony Lucas Book Awards and a member of the Journalism Advisory Council of the Religion News Service and the Faculty Advisory Board of the Center for Journalism Ethics. He has spoken at the Smithsonian Institute, Yale University, UCLA, and now UT Austin, among other venues, and has appeared on NPR. In fact, he's going to appear on NPR again very soon, apparently, CNN, and the PBS NewsHour. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Freedman this evening as the Fall 2024 Gale Family Foundation Lecturer to share with us his lecture, Fighting Hatred in the Heartland, Hubert Humphrey's Battles Against Antisemitism and Extremism in Mid-Century Middle America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Freedman.
Thank you so much. An introduction like that always puts me in mind of Mark Twain's character Tom Sawyer, who you remember hides out to hear the eulogies at his own funeral, knowing that they're all untrue and way too positive. But thank you so much. And I also want to start out by giving my own thanks to the Gale family for endowing this lecture series. It's one of the great traditions within Jewish communities to endow lecture series, to the Schusterman family for the wonderful Center for Jewish Studies here at UT, Dr. Jonathan Kaplan, who's been just an incredible host to me these days and such a formidable scholar and educator himself, and Emily Petrowski, who just made so many things go so effortlessly these past few days. I also, being here in Austin, realized that I'd like to dedicate these words tonight to the blessed memory of a great friend of mine in narrative nonfiction writing, a Texas Jew, grew up in San Antonio, named Nick Kotz. And actually, one of Nick's books is about his family history from Ukraine to Texas, called The Harness Maker's Son, if I remember correctly. Nick wrote a book that was tremendously influential on me and even on the work I did about Hubert Humphrey, called Judgment Days, which was about the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King during this very tight time period from the day John F. Kennedy is assassinated and LBJ becomes president until the week in the spring of 1968 when Lyndon Johnson announces he won't run for re-election and Martin Luther King is assassinated. It's an extraordinary book, and I know that Nick did a lot of the research for it here in Austin at the LBJ Library. And the way he wrote that book, instead of doing a sweeping cradle-to-grave biography of either Dr. King or President Johnson, but to look at this fervent, intense period of partnership and then, acrimonious falling out, was really an important lesson for me in how I wanted to write about Hubert Humphrey. And so, Nick, you are remembered, and you remain a great inspiration to me here in your home state. But to start, many of us in this room know very well the myth and also the reality of the Jewish view of what America would be. That this was the Golden Medina, this was the streets being paved with gold, this was the rescue, the sanctuary from the danger and deprivations of Tsarist Eastern Europe. And it was true, and it also became very much part of our popular culture thanks to Fiddler on the Roof, among many other representations of it. And like any effective myth, the myth of the Golden Medina and America in the eyes of Eastern European Jews as they came here as immigrants has to have a certain amount of factuality in it to stick. You can't just fabricate a myth to make it meaningful for people. And sure enough, we know that in the American Jewish experience here, in many ways, it's an extraordinary story of inclusion and achievement, and in all sorts of fields, finding ways to become heroic and cherished figures, not just for the American Jewish community, but for America writ large. My wife is a wonderful graphic designer, and as she was devising this PowerPoint and we were debating who to put on the slide, the challenge was not to make it look like a checkerboard or a Zoom screen with a bunch of little boxes, because there are so many great American Jewish achievers we could have put up there. And that itself tells you a lot. And, out of many other choices, we chose, of course, the novelist Philip Roth, the jurist Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the director Steven Spielberg, the baseball pitcher Sandy Koufax, and the singer, director, now memoirist Barbara Streisand. And again, what's important here is that these people not only represented a certain kind of American Jewish achievement, but became part of the fabric of American life writ large. And that's as good as our story can get in this country. But there's always been another story, too, which has been the story of Jew hatred in this country and antisemitism in this country. And we've seen it rear its ugly head in recent years when we really thought, many of us perhaps, that we were past it, that these were just fringy ideas that would never get a purchase in the mainstream again. And so when we saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, when we saw campaign ads in 2016 and 2020 that talked about globalists, that kind of dog whistle terminology, and turned George Soros into literally this octopus figure who is controlling the whole world with his Jewish wealth. And finally, when we saw the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and we've experienced the turmoil and anxieties on campuses over the last year as well. That's been a jolt for many of us, and it's made certain writers, even writers who I otherwise respect, feel like this means the American Jewish success story is over, nothing's been accomplished, we've never been through this before. But in fact, the story I want to tell tonight, which is harrowing but also in some ways reassuring, is about how we have fought these battles before and how we've won them, and we've partly won them because we've had allies like Hubert Humphrey. And if you were thinking about where to look for a story of the battle against anti-Semitism and the triumph against it and other forms of extremism, Minneapolis wouldn't be your obvious choice, and Hubert Humphrey wouldn't be your obvious hero, for reasons I'm going to go into. And yet, in the 1940s, that is exactly what happened, and it's exactly where it happened. And to understand the significance of what's happening there, before I tell you more about Humphrey, I want to tell you some more about Minneapolis. First of all, forget everything you think you know about Minneapolis, the Blue City. You know, the Minneapolis that is part of the political constituency of Tim Walz and Amy Klobuchar and Keith Ellison, and has a liberal Jewish mayor named Jacob Fry. Forget about everything you think you know. I want to take you back in time to Minneapolis, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, when it was one of the most anti-Semitic cities in the country, as well as one of the most racist, and was notorious for that. And the anti-Semitism in Minneapolis went beyond what's familiar in many other cities. It had a deepness and a breadth and a depth that, in a very sad way, made it almost singular. Now, Minneapolis was a city where, and Minnesota was a state where one of the heroes was the aviator Charles Lindbergh. And many people remember him for piloting the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic in the 1920s, or for the tabloidish murder trial for the murder of his young child. But of course, a lot of us here also know that Charles Lindbergh was the most appealing public face of the America First movement, of isolationism in the 1930s and early 1940s. That's why when Philip Roth wrote his prescient, his tragically prescient alt history, The Plot Against America, his premise was what would have happened if Charles Lindbergh had defeated Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. And Lindbergh was the one who, just a couple of months before the Pearl Harbor attack, is giving a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, at which he says there are only three groups that are trying to push America into Europe's war: the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. And of course, you have to remember that for a lot of people like Lindbergh, Roosevelt and the Jews were the same thing anyway. They were putting out rumors that his real name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were describing his political program as the Jew Deal. And that was someone who put those ideas in popular use, and with all the power of his celebrity and heroism behind them, and was influential more in Minneapolis than maybe any city in the country. Then, to give you another sense of Minneapolis, this group, this is not a bowling league team wearing their logo gear. This is a group called the Silver Legion, more popularly known as the Silver Shirts. And they were an explicitly pro-Nazi group founded in North Carolina by Claude Pelly, explicitly modeled on Hitler's brown shirts paramilitary. That's why they were called the Silver Shirts. And while they tried to extend their tendrils throughout the country, Minneapolis was one of the places where they had the greatest welcome. In Minneapolis, when they held rallies, it wasn't just, and blamed the Jews for the ills of the world and the Great Depression, and in the internally contradictory illogic of anti-Semites forever blamed Jews for both being rapacious capitalists and Bolshevik revolutionaries all at the same time somehow. When they held their meetings, it wasn't just a disenfranchised, frustrated, looking for someone to blame white working class, white Christian working class that went to those meetings. It was the president of the Board of Education. It was the president of the Business Association. It was doctors and dentists and teachers, one of whom you'll hear from later in my presentation, and ministers. And speaking of ministers, the most important theologian and clergyman in Minneapolis was this man, William Bell Riley. You may not have heard of him, but he deserves a critical biography of his own. William Bell Riley was the living link between William Jennings Bryan, the most important fundamentalist Christian public figure in the early part of the 20th century, and Billy Graham later. William Bell Riley was the person who told William Jennings Bryan, hey, there's this trial of a teacher named Scopes in Tennessee. You ought to go and prosecute him. It's because of Riley that Bryan went to take on the so-called monkey trial case. And then towards the end of William Bell Riley's life, he brings a young Billy Graham to Minneapolis to become the president of the university that Riley had founded and trains him up. So William Bell Riley was a formidable figure. You can tell he has a certain sense about himself by looking at how he's dressed in this portrait, with his pocket square and his tie done just so, and his sage mien, that he was proud and saved clippings that I read in my research of newspapers that would say he's not a Bible thumper. He's a different kind of fundamentalist Christian. And he was an institution builder. He was someone who built up First Baptist Church in Minneapolis, who then created a missionary school, a university, a publishing program. And William Bell Riley had two holy books and two causes. One of his holy books was, of course, the Bible, and his first cause was to stamp out the teaching of evolution in public schools, which is why I was so interested in the Scopes trial. And when he realized by the end of the Scopes trial that he had sort of lost that battle and he would need another cause, well, just in time, he found his other holy book. And it was given to him in the mid-1930s by another evangelical minister from Kentucky. And that book was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, as many of us know, was a czarist era forgery, again purporting to show how the Jews were the revolutionaries of the world. William Bell Riley, with all of his credibility, with all of his erudition, this was a man who would fleck his sermons with references to Plato and Shakespeare and George Bernard Shaw, fully believed that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion decoded the world for him. And he would say things like this in his sermons. Fact number one, the Jew fingerprints of the Protocols are in every nation on earth. Fact number two, the representatives of this race are at the elbow of every great ruler on earth, dictating national policies. The Protocols present a definite plan to have every movement that would stall the political maneuvers of Jewry labeled, and he uses air quotes, persecution, in order to blind the soft-hearted Gentile nation until the communist coup is accomplished. And people in the Jewish community in Minneapolis were so alarmed, not by what he was saying, but who was saying it. And one Jewish lawyer writes a letter at one point to Riley and says, people respect you, people look up to you. When you put this sludge out there, they believe it because you're saying it. And Riley writes back to him in one of his familiar tones of more in sorrow than anger, and ends with a rhetorical question, not a rhetorical question, he answers it actually. Why then has the Jew become so unpopular in this country? It is my profound conviction he has nobody to blame for it but himself. And that's where the religious discourse in Minneapolis comes from, is from Riley. And what this means in terms of daily life for the Jews of Minneapolis is not only some of the familiar forms of bigotry that we know, the restrictive covenants in housing, the country clubs that won't let you be a member, not being able to get hospital privileges. Minneapolis takes it a few steps beyond that. That building on the lower left, that's the headquarters of the AAA for Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, a Jew could not belong to the automobile club. Jewish students, when they went to the University of Minnesota in the 1930s and early 40s, were subject to a secret census. The dean of students tracked Jewish students and reported their names to a right-wing political operative named Ray Chase, who would later use that information to try to smear them when they got into public life. So this was not any other place, and it later came to the attention of the muckraking journalist Carrie McWilliams that there was something very different between Minneapolis and St. Paul. which are right next to each other. In some places, they're divided by the Mississippi River, but in a lot of places, they're across the street from each other, and you wouldn't even know if you went from Minneapolis into St. Paul. Yet St. Paul was a city that was relatively tolerant of Jews and of blacks, and Minneapolis was ferociously discriminatory against both. And that's why Carrie McWilliams entitled his article, Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, as in the Twin Cities. And this is another explanation for why the Jew hatred had such deep roots in Minneapolis and was so tenacious. That St. Paul, it wasn't that people were intrinsically more idealistic there, but St. Paul was a majority or plurality Catholic city in which the Catholics knew they were surrounded by Protestants in the entire upper Midwest. And they understood if we need to have allies, there are going to be other minority groups. And St. Paul had one of these classic old-fashioned political machines, and they figured also to win elections. Who are our allies? The Jews and the blacks, the other minority groups. And so out of expediency, but which yielded a form of idealism, St. Paul was much more inclusive of Jews and blacks. Minneapolis was a city that was probably 85% Protestant, Northern European, Scandinavian, British Isles. The Jews and blacks together comprised maybe 5%. You add in the Catholics, it's maybe 15%. And so in Minneapolis, the Protestants didn't have to give any quarter, and they sure didn't give any quarter. They could beat down on the minority groups because they had the numbers on their side. Now, let's turn to Hubert Humphrey, the person who's going to come to Minneapolis. If you had to look at geography and demography, you would say that there was never a less likely champion of equality for Jews as well as black people than Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey is a very vanilla guy from a very vanilla place. That very vanilla place is Dolan, South Dakota, population 500 at its peak, 250 miles due west of Minneapolis, out in the wheat fields of South Dakota. And Dolan has been set up by the railroad company, the Chicago and Northwestern, for the simple commercial purpose of having a train depot there from which the farmers would send their grain into the flour mills of Minneapolis, ranchers would send their livestock into the slaughterhouses of St. Paul. All the prices would be monopolistically set by the railroad, the packing houses, and the flour mills, and the farmers and ranchers had to live with it. And that's where Hubert Humphrey grows up. But he grows up in a moment of time when initially grain prices are very high. And his family runs the local drugstore. There's Hubert sitting at the soda fountain where he had to do all of his unpaid labor. And they, for a moment in time, were maybe the most affluent family in town. That's their house, the prettiest house in Dolan. The reason you know it is that they're 1,000 miles from any ocean, and it has a widow's walk. So unless you have money to burn, you don't put on that kind of an architectural affectation. And Hubert Humphrey's childhood there, though, is interrupted in some important ways for his later political life. We think of the Great Depression starting with the stock market crash and the bank runs and so forth in 1929. But as I discovered, in the grain belt of the Dakotas, economic calamity started almost a decade earlier when crop prices, which had been inflated by World War I, plummeted as Europe returned to normality in the late 19-teens and especially in the early 1920s. By 1922, the Humphrey family has lost that beautiful house. It's been repossessed, and they have to sell it under duress. Their drugstore, HH, the father, is being paid by farmers in the form of a chicken or a side of beef or some baked goods because no one has money. To his great credit, HH is going to give, in 1920s dollars, $14,000 of credit to his customers, knowing that they'll never, ever be able to repay them. The banks close in Dolan. One of the bankers takes his own life. It's a disaster. And when that happens in the 1920s, Hubert Humphrey becomes a New Dealer before there's a New Deal. Because in very conservative, both politically and theological Dolan, where the view has been that if people fall on hard times, it's their own fault. It's their bad decision-making. It's their being spendthrifts and their being the hare instead of the tortoise. And Hubert Humphrey realizes, looking around, not only at what has befallen his whole family, but the whole town, It can't be everybody's individual fault. And everyone can't just go to the church on bended knee asking for charity to get out of this. You need a government that will intervene. And that's the beginning of him becoming a New Dealer. And it fits in with two other important elements of his childhood. One is the effect of his father, who is the rare liberal Democrat in town, and who talks to Humphrey about Woodrow Wilson and Al Smith. And it's also a chance encounter Humphrey has when he's 11 years old with a black road graveling crew, the first black people he's ever seen in his life, who show up when this road is being put through Dolan, which is a really red-letter day because it's going to break some of the power of the railroad monopoly, and being his father's son, being the son of a father who said, if you treat people like dogs, you can expect to be bitten, Hubert Humphrey befriends those black people. And it says something about his openness to difference, which is going to matter enormously when he meets Jews later in his life. Well, Hubert Humphrey, in spite of his family's economic duress, is able to start college in 1929, of all years, at the University of Minnesota. But midway through his sophomore year, his family now has lost the drugstore too. They have to go to another town to try to start over again. And there's no money for Hubert and his brother Ralph to stay in colleges, so he drops out and goes to this town of Huron, South Dakota, and earns a pharmacy license in a hurry so that he can work in the family drugstore. And he's out of college for 5 years without the particular expectation of ever going back. But during those years, partly by dint of a visit to Washington, D.C., he's filled with this idea that maybe public service will be my life. And when he meets his future wife, Muriel, she's the one who puts the steel in his backbone to finally say to his father, who is a rather domineering man, that I have to leave the drugstore. I want to go back to college. And his father reluctantly agrees to let him go. So he goes back to the University of Minnesota at age 26, 27 in 1937. He finished his bachelor's degree in 1939 at age 28. He's a father, he's married, and he wants to go to graduate school, but he needs money to do it. Muriel, his wife, has to give up her full-time job because their little baby girl, Nancy. Hubert, who's been working part-time in drugstores in Minneapolis to help pay his way through school, knows he may not be able to continue to work even half-time with what graduate school is going to require from him. And just by pure luck, one of his professors at the University of Minnesota has a friend who's a professor at Louisiana State who sends a letter saying almost verbatim, hey, Everon Kirkpatrick, if you have any Yankees there who would be willing to take a $400 graduate assistantship to come down to Dixie, let me know. And that is why Hubert Humphrey ends up going to graduate school at Louisiana State University. $400 may not sound like a lot to us now, but corrected for the cost of living, it's like $8,500, which was a significant amount of money for Hubert and Muriel. So they move to Baton Rouge, and this becomes the single most important year in Hubert Humphrey's life. When he goes to Baton Rouge, a couple of things happen. Number one, it's the first time he's been below the Mason-Dixon line. He lives in a city that's 1/3 black and in a Jim Crow society for the first time. He sees American apartheid in action. And number two, less expectedly, he makes Jewish friends for the first time in his life. One of his buddies on the debating team is a law student named Alvin Rubin. And Alvin Rubin had grown up in Alexandria, Louisiana. It's a classic Jewish story. That's true in a lot of Texas, too. Alvin Rubin's father was an immigrant from Lithuania who had been working as a peddler all across the South and finally just got fed up with being on the move, and plunked himself down in Alexandria and opened what else? A dry goods store. And that's where Alvin Rubin grows up. Star student, goes to LSU, meets Hubert Humphrey. And when they're friends on the debate team together, Alvin Rubin talks to Hubert Humphrey about his 5 uncles who were all still in Lithuania, which at this point, because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, is being invaded from one side by the Red Army and from the other by the Wehrmacht. And he tells Hubert Humphrey about his fears that all of his uncles are going to die, as in fact ultimately all of them will die. And this, not only in a general sense, sensitizes Hubert Humphrey to something about the Jewish experience and Jewish precariousness in Europe, but also in America, But it makes him an interventionist on World War II at a time when, especially on a college campus where all the men are draft age, isolationism is the dominant philosophy. And what ties it all together in Hubert Humphrey's year at LSU is this remarkable man, Rudolf Eberle. Rudolf Eberle was a sociology professor in Germany whose wife, Franziska, a remarkable person herself, was the daughter of an eminent sociologist who was also a leading anti-Nazi figure there. And Rudolf Eberle also is deeply alarmed when the Nazi Party explodes its share of votes between 1928 and 1932. And his academic project becomes answering the question that torments him: how can this country that I consider so cultured, so intellectual, so tolerant, embrace Nazism within a couple of years? How does a democracy become totalitarian in the blink of an eye? And he starts to do research on that subject in one particular province where the Nazis were especially strong. And because of that research, once Hitler consolidates power, including over the universities, including the University of Kiel, where Eberle is persona non grata right away. And then, of course, the Nazis require him to, deliver his family tree, which shows one Jewish great-grandparent. And like many part Jews in Germany, Eberle's family had generations earlier converted to Christianity, but of course that doesn't matter in Nazi Germany. So for both of those reasons, his dissident scholarship and his 1/8 Jewish blood, Eberle is stripped of his job, his assets are seized, and he's kicked out of the country. And he ends up in 1938 literally on the docks of Baltimore with Franziska and their 3 little kids, wondering, where the heck do I go now? How do we survive? And thanks to the Ford Foundation and LSU, they cobbled together enough money to give him a job, not even as a professor yet, although he'll ultimately become one, but an instructor. And Hubert Humphrey takes his year-long seminar in what was called social problems. And the problem that Eberle is really talking about, social movements, not social problems. What he's really talking about in that seminar constantly is what he learned about how totalitarians come to power. And he shares this with Humphrey, and it will become deeply influential. He talks about the cynicism of the establishment right that felt we can use the Nazis as our bully boys, but we'll ultimately control them. They won't control us. Wrong. And he talks about the complacency of middle-class non-Jewish Germans who thought that as the Jews got persecuted, it would never come to them. Wrong. And he talks about even the psychology of what he says, how the Nazis offered a psychic outlet for the repressed ambitions and emotions of rural youth, how they lent prestige and authority to persons of mediocre, of subordinate positions. Remind anybody of MAGA? And that's what Humphrey picks up from Eberle. And then Eberle also talks about his own family's experience of dispossession and life as refugees. And then he ties it all together by saying the plight of the Jew in Germany is the plight of the black in the Jim Crow South. And Humphrey, decades later, will remember something that Eberle said one day in the seminar. And he says, out of this group, there wouldn't be over 2 of you that would have resisted Hitler. And I think that becomes a mission statement for Hubert Humphrey. Because when he leaves LSU after his 1 year in the South, a lot of New Dealers of his age leaving the Jim Crow society and heading back to the at least legally integrated North would wipe their brow and say, thank God I'm leaving benighted Dixie and going back to the enlightened North. Interestingly, Humphrey does not indulge himself in that easy moral superiority. When he goes back to Minneapolis, suddenly he sees the Jew hatred and the black hatred that has been there all along, that he had never really fathomed before, while being busy with college, while dropping out for 5 years. Now he sees it for what it is. And now, thanks to Rudolf Eberle and Alvin Rubin, he also has an understanding of the necessity of confronting it. But he also needs to know more. And Hubert Humphrey finds 2 tutors in Minneapolis. One is a former Pullman porter who becomes the founder, publisher, and editor of the main black newspaper in Minneapolis, which is still published to this day by his granddaughter. That man is Cecil Newman. The other is a Jewish lawyer named Sam Shiner. And Sam Shiner, when he graduated law school, couldn't be hired by any law firm because he was a Jew. And he'd been making his living as a jazz pianist in Minneapolis. But the Jewish community was so alarmed there by the warm reception given to the Silver Shirts and other similarly minded groups that they pulled together a salary for Sam Shiner and had him do basically intelligence gathering. Sam Shiner would find Gentile students from the university who were sympathetic to what he was doing and send them to infiltrate meetings like the Silver Shirts and send them to William Bell Riley's worship services and have them writing down license plates so he could see, Shiner could run the identities on the plates and find out who attended these meetings. Shiner would subscribe to all of these pro-Nazi periodicals. In fact, there's one almost serial-comic story of the editor of one of them shows up in Minneapolis one night and goes to Shiner's house, although he thought it was Steiner, because Sam Shiner would slightly Teutonicize his name. And Shiner's not home, but his wife answers the door, and this pro-Nazi editor says, hey, I'm in town, for a meeting. I don't have anywhere to stay. You're a subscriber. Maybe I could stay with you tonight. And she quickly cobbles up some excuse. And luckily, the guy goes away and finds lodging elsewhere. But that's the kind of work Sam Shiner was doing. And Cecil Newman was using the pages of the Spokesman to call out all these forms of racism, police brutality, labor unions that wouldn't have black members, breweries that wouldn't have black workers. And Shiner and Newman are friends. And they understand that the battle against anti-Semitism and the battle against racism is one battle. And Cecil Newman, when he's writing about episodes of racism in Minneapolis or elsewhere in the country, on one of his articles puts on the headline, Hitler must be laughing. Because he understood something we now know to be true, which is that Hitler's exterminationist program against the Jews was in many ways modeled on racism in the United States and Jim Crow in the United States. And similarly, Sam Shiner and members of the Jewish community in Minneapolis understood when they saw the battles against Jim Crow in the South that that was a battle they needed to in some way be involved in. And so both of them had been valiant figures, and they had utterly failed. They had utterly failed to make change in Minneapolis because they were powerless. They had the right views, they had the right morals, but they had small numbers and they had no meaningful allies. And then suddenly, here comes Hubert Humphrey to town. And Hubert Humphrey, even though ostensibly he's returned to Minneapolis to study for his doctorate, he quickly becomes active in public life through positions with the WPA and then World War II home front preparedness. And he realizes that he needs people to teach him about racism and anti-Semitism in Minneapolis. He now knows it's there and it's deeply entrenched. But he needs to know more about it. And Sam Shiner and Cecil Newman become his teachers, his instructors, and he learns from them. But what he gives to them is access to political power. Someone who has political skill, someone who has political ambition, someone who will fight their battles not for them, but with them. And they've never had that before. So Hubert Humphrey in the early 1940s is building up this public life and caring deeply about these issues, and he makes his first run for mayor in 1943. And he runs in some ways actually a rather conventional campaign. He's the candidate favored by organized labor. He's the candidate who says, I'm going to clean up the crime downtown. He's the candidate who says, hey, don't forget, I have Norwegian ancestry, which will be a big selling point in a very Scandinavian city like Minneapolis. And as won't surprise anyone who remembers Hubert Humphrey as a candidate, he's endlessly energetic, and he almost defeats a complacent conservative incumbent, but falls short. It's the next year when Hubert Humphrey really, though, breaks cover as a defender of equality and rights and personal safety of Jews. And it happens this way. Some of you may know the name Gerald L.K. Smith. If you don't, you should. He's a presentiment of a certain person who's been part of our national political life since 2016. Gerald L.K. Smith was an ordained minister, grew up in western Wisconsin, ends up going to Louisiana and working closely with Huey Long at the time when Long was this fairly liberal version of a populist. And after Long is assassinated, Gerald L.K. Smith ends up dallying some with the silver shirts and then making his way to New York and then to Detroit and soliciting money from big corporate interests and presenting himself then as a pseudo-populist. And his program is, he's a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist, his term. He's a self-proclaimed America Firster, his term. He actually forms the America First political party. He propounds something he calls Christian economics, which is basically a social safety net for Protestants. And his attitude about blacks is they should be sent back to Africa. And his political program for Jews is they should be quarantined and left to age and die off. Gerald L.K. Smith is a regular visitor to Minneapolis, just like the silver shirts, and he has very powerful patrons. One of them is Ernest Lundeen, a senator from Minnesota, formerly a liberal and a World War I pacifist who's become a right-wing pseudo-populist. When Lundeen dies, actually in a rather mysterious plane crash, which if any of you listen to season 1 of Rachel Maddow's podcast, Ultra, you've heard that story. I won't give you the spoiler. But after he dies, his widow, Norma, becomes Gerald L.K. Smith's patron in Minneapolis. And so it comes to pass that in the late winter of 1944, Gerald L.K. Smith wants to give a speech at the Municipal Auditorium in Minneapolis. He usually would speak in rented hotel rooms or other private venues. But because this is a public venue, it's a place that he needs the city council to give him permission to speak at. And it becomes a real cause célèbre whether he will get city council permission or not. When it comes to the night for the vote, the council chambers are packed out. There are dozens of speakers. And Hubert Humphrey is one of those speakers. And Hubert Humphrey does something to Gerald L.K. Smith that, to use a neologism, a term that absolutely was not in use in 1944, bugs out Gerald L.K. Smith. What Hubert Humphrey says is that you can't be a good Christian and be an anti-Semite because Jesus was a Jew. And now the historical Jewishness of Jesus is a no-brainer. Everyone with an iota of sense or knowledge grants that point. But in 1944, in Minneapolis, to posit the historical Jewishness of Jesus was to walk out on a ledge all by yourself. And it went right for the soft spot in Gerald L.K. Smith. It went right at his image of being a good Christian. Well, the reason I know what Hubert Humphrey said, his comments are not preserved, but I read a 16-page handwritten letter with impeccable penmanship and flawless grammar by a Minneapolis public school teacher named Ida Schoening to Hubert Humphrey after that. And she writes to him, "Mr. Humphrey, what makes you a Christian? When did you become a Christian? What did you do to become a Christian? Jesus Christ has no place for a counterfeit Christian in his ranks. You belong to that modernist outfit who do not believe in the Bible. The modernist preachers have reduced Jesus the Christ to a mere man, putting him in the same place where the Jews have placed him. Mr. Humphrey, everyone who knows the Bible knows that Jesus was not a Jew. Jesus is God's only begotten Son. Certainly no one would have the stupidity to say that God is a Jew. Mr. Humphrey, if Jesus is a Jew as you claim, then pray, why don't the Jews bestow a bit of their brotherly love on him? Answer me that. What's more, it is just about time that this anti-Semitic bugaboo were dragged out in the open and exposed for what it is, a big lie cooked up by the Jews themselves." So that was the kind of pushback he got for that statement. It tells you what the risk was involved. And Hubert Humphrey answered many letters, including some hate mail. He didn't happen to answer Ida Schoening, public school teacher, but he gave a form of answer a couple of weeks later when the Reformed Temple in Minneapolis, Temple Israel, which is still there now, invites him to speak at a Kabbalat Shabbat service. And Humphrey really gives kind of his version of Devar Torah. He's not speaking out of the Parsha that week yet. He kind of traverses over a lot of the social justice prophets, referring to Amos and Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah. But he was a very, very knowledgeable reader of the Bible, Hubert Humphrey was. And in that talk at Temple Israel that night, he says, we've relied on ritual, on pious pronouncements rather than action. Faith is only as strong as its believers. We have failed to believe. The ancient prophets all cried out against injustice, proclaiming the doctrine of social justice. So he's speaking very knowledgeably out of Judaic text to posit a set of political values, and even goes on in somewhat narcissistic manner to give his own 10 commandments, which include the commandment that you should have, that I'm the Lord thy God, but thou shalt remember that I am also the God of the earth. I have no favorite children. The Negro, the Jew, the Hindu, the Chinese, Russian, and Mexican are all my beloved children. So in a very specific and very Judaic kind of way, he's presenting himself as a person who's going to take on the battle against intolerance in Minneapolis and make it the key to his political identity there. And, you know, I don't want to exceptionalize what Humphrey is doing, admirable though it is, because, of course, he's doing this as we get to 1944 and 1945 against the backdrop of the revelation of the Shoah. You know, Dwight Eisenhower brings journalists to one of the concentration camps his troops have liberated and says, take film, take still photos, write articles. People on the home front will not believe it's true unless you show them the evidence. And so that's having a significant effect on the home front, even in a place that's been as filled with intolerance as Minneapolis. So part of what's going on 44 and especially 1945 is the revelation for the mass of Americans of what the Holocaust was. The other part of it, which has always fascinated me, is a body of popular culture and popular journalism that's changing the definition of who is an American. Some of this began during the war. You may know the term Judeo-Christian tradition. Let me tell you something that perhaps you don't know unless you've read Deborah Dash Moore's wonderful book, G.I. Jews. That was no tradition. The Judeo-Christian tradition was invented during World War II. It was invented to create a fighting force composed of people from different faith streams, and it was invented to say that fighting against officially atheistic fascism, the American army was an army of believers. And that would also later figure very much into juxtaposition against communism during the Cold War. You remember the phrase godless communism. So the martyrology of the Judeo-Christian tradition is in early 1944, a troop ship called the Dorchester is steaming across the North Atlantic, and when it's near Greenland, Nazi U-boats sink it. And it's ghastly. Hundreds of those troops drown. The gasoline and oil from the boat catches fire floating on the surface. Other American troops burn to death even while they're in the water. And there are 4 chaplains on that boat, 2 Protestant ministers, 1 Catholic priest, 1 Reformed Jewish rabbi. And they tend to each other's flocks. Doesn't matter whose person of what faith stream needs, basically, in fact, what Catholics would call last rites. These clergymen are helping whoever is closest to them. And they agree among themselves that they will not take one of the lifeboats, that they will go down with the ship and perish, trying to save as many people as they could. And through the survivors of the sinking, the story becomes known. And it is galvanizing on the home front as this real-life parable of Judeo-Christian traditions. That's part of it. And then you have popular culture, things like a Superman radio series that has Superman fighting a version of the Ku Klux Klan, thinly veiled, called the Clan of the Fiery Cross. And this Superman ad that goes with it that says, if you hear anybody talking against a schoolmate or anyone else because of his religion, race, or national origin, don't wait. And this is the most important line. Tell him that kind of talk is un-American. This is a radical redefinition of who is American. That not only is it bad ethically or morally to be a bigot, it's un-American to be a bigot. And then you have Frank Sinatra's song and film, The House I Live In. And if you've never seen the film, you should Google it. It's out there floating around on YouTube. And it starts with Sinatra in a recording studio cutting a song with a big band. And then he says, I want to take a cigarette break in the alley, then we'll record the next song. And while he's in the alley, you can see a gang of teenagers chasing a boy and pinning him against the wall. You can see they're cowering. And there are little clues, like the boy being dark-haired and a lot of the gang being fair-skinned hair and blonde-haired, that this is clearly a Gentile gang attacking a Jewish kid. It's never said, but it's made as clear as could be. And Sinatra steps in the middle to interrupt what's going to be the beatdown and says amazing things. And he says to these teenagers, "You're behaving like a bunch of Nazis." And after he lectures them, then he sings a song, the title song, "The House I Live In," whose lyrics are written by the same lyricist, Abel Meeropol, writing under the pen name Lewis Allen, who had written the lyrics for Billie Holiday's anti-lynching anthem, "Strange Fruit." And the most important lines in the song, "The House I Live In," say, "Every race and religion, that's America to me." And so not only do you have the revelation of the Holocaust, the proof of what happens when anti-Semitism is allowed to run amok, but you also have this body of popular culture and entertainment and popular journalism that's telling people it's un-American to have those feelings. And it's against that backdrop in the spring of 1945 that Hubert Humphrey runs for mayor. It's so important that that's the moment he's doing it. And not only is it happening against these backdrops, which make the scales fall from the eyes of a lot of people in Minneapolis who were the polite anti-Semites, who thought that, well, it's one thing not to want them next door or to go to your summer resort, but that's not the same as what the Nazis are doing, except that now they see that actually is the same thing. One is the logical extension of the other. And you have GIs who are coming back to their families or going to live in Quonset huts at the University of Minnesota on the GI Bill, who have brought back from the war this idea that we spent all this blood and treasure to defeat fascism abroad. What do we do about the discrimination and hatred on the home front? Do we just say things can go back as usual, or do we realize we have a battle on the home front too? And yet, at the same time, incredibly in Minneapolis, that spring of 1945, there's a wave of attacks by gangs, just like the gang in Frank Sinatra's film, on Jewish children and teenagers. There are cars that they're in are being forced off the road. They're being beaten and forced to give Heil Hitler salutes. They're being pushed through plate glass windows, and when they start to bleed out, their attackers are saying, "Yeah, show me some of that Jew blood." And it so infuriates the Jewish community, which has already lost a dozen of its young men in war, that 2,000 strong, they hold a mass meeting at the junior high school in the Jewish neighborhood on the north side of Minneapolis. And at that meeting, where the mayor and the police chief are, one of the rabbis in town says almost verbatim, "Is this what our boys have been dying for?" And the mayor is like, "Oh, you know, teenage hooliganism, stop your belly aching. This is nothing to get all riled up about." And the police chief pretty much parrots the same line. And it's Hubert Humphrey who says, "This city has been warned repeatedly that it has a major problem with racism and anti-Semitism, and it has done nothing. And it was inevitable that it would turn violent, and now it has." And Humphrey runs in that campaign on a 5-point program for human rights and civil rights. And remarkably, in the city where blacks and Jews are only 5% of the population, he wins a smashing victory. And had it been a year earlier with a different backdrop, probably wouldn't have happened. Had it been a couple of years later during the Cold War, might not have happened. But everything aligns for it to happen now. And when Hubert Humphrey comes into office in Minneapolis, he knows you have to do two things. You have to change laws and you have to change minds. And he changes laws, or attempts to, and is often blunted initially by the city council by putting forth laws against discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing. The police force is notorious for its harassment of black and Jewish citizens of Minneapolis. He orders every cop to get human relations training, as they call it at the University of Minnesota, every cop to carry the city's human rights ordinance on their person. And as a side note, Hubert Humphrey's rapid ascent into the Senate means that police reform program is never completed, and that paves the way to George Floyd under Derek Chauvin's knee. And But Hubert Humphrey, as I said a moment ago, can't get these laws through the city council. And so what he realizes he has to do is mobilize public opinion to pressure the elected officials. And what he has to do that is make Minneapolis look at itself in the mirror. And he does a remarkable thing. He brings in a black sociologist, Charles S. Johnson of Fisk University, who's an expert in leading studies of race riots around the country. Usually a city like Chicago or Mobile has the riot, and then they bring him in to say, why did it happen? And he makes a bunch of recommendations that are never implemented. Hubert Humphrey has a different idea. Let's bring him in before there's a riot. But it's audacious to have overwhelmingly white Minneapolis expected to take orders from a black man. But the secret weapon for Charles S. Johnson is he knows all these women had Rosie the Riveter jobs during the war, and that they're not especially happy of being just shunted back into the kitchen. They want something purposeful to do. And so they become his core of volunteers. And what they do is they go around with surveys, collating what we would now call a database. It's done by, pencils on pieces of paper rather than computer strokes, but it's the same idea, exploring and proving the depth, breadth, and venomousness of different forms of discrimination in Minneapolis all across the board, in recreation, in religion, in labor, in business, in politics, and backed up by what we would call ethnographic work in anthropology. They also solicit families' stories of what they've gone through. And you can see one of those, former Rosie the Riveter, now volunteers with Charles S. Johnson, interviewing a Nisei Japanese family and an African-American family. And what comes away, the end product of that survey is irrefutable evidence that Minneapolis has this massive problem. And the way I envision it is this. A lot of people think of Hubert Humphrey as this really genial, nice guy, corny, even trite. And he was that, but he also had a backbone that people didn't understand. And when I think about this survey and what he used it for in Minneapolis, he grabbed complacent, self-satisfied Minneapolis by the scruff of its neck and smashed its head down into its own hatred and made it look at that hatred and wouldn't lift up its head till it acknowledged that that hatred was there. And it's with the shift in public opinion and the evidence of this survey that Humphrey finally gets his laws through the city council. And all of this puts him on the national map. There are magazine articles, how Minneapolis beat the bigots. He talks on a radio program called Neither Free Nor Equal. He brings in the special showings of Gentleman's Agreement to keep the pressure on against antisemitism in town. And this is what's going to lead him ultimately to his national political forum at the 1948 Democratic Convention. But there are still people in Minneapolis who were the followers of the Silver Shirts. There were still people in Minneapolis who were the followers of Gerald L.K. Smith. There are still people in Minneapolis who are the fan base of Charles Lindbergh. And they are not at all happy with what Hubert Humphrey has done. And Hubert Humphrey, one night in 1947, he's coming home late from the rubber chicken circuit as mayor. And at this point, he'd already received so much hate mail and at least one credible death threat that his police chief had intercepted in that case, that the police chief says, you have to have an armed escort with you at all times. But Humphrey, being Humphrey, is getting driven home by his armed police escort. He's giving a couple of city council members a ride. And he's like, oh, it's late. There are all these council members they have to get home too. Officer Bartholomew, you just take them home. I can walk to my front door from here. So he gets out at the curb, starts walking to his front door. Strange thing. The nearest street light is out. And so in the dark, Hubert Humphrey is there wiggling his key in the front lock, trying to get it to work, and 3 bullets whiz by his head. Muriel, his wife, who always waited up late to talk politics with him, hears this commotion outside, opens the door, hurdles him in. Hubert Humphrey says something really stupid. He says, why would anyone want to shoot me? Well, actually, there are a whole lot of reasons, Hubert. But anyway, then he and Muriel try to put together what just happened. And Muriel remembers that she had heard their pet dog bark, and then she heard a sound that she thought was a car backfiring. Now they realize it was the shooter, the would-be assassin, and what they posit is that the dog barking had thrown off the assassin's concentration, and that's why he missed. Well, in a way that would never be possible now, Hubert Humphrey keeps the news out of the papers for 6 weeks, and the police go on to investigate. And ultimately, their investigation leads him to this young man, Maynard Orlando Nelson, who was infuriated with Humphrey because of because of Humphrey's civil rights program, because of Humphrey's confrontations with Gerald L.K. Smith, of whom Maynard Orlando Nelson was a follower. And this is the kind of hate mail that Maynard Orlando Nelson had been sending. He'd been saying, when they start talking of racial equality, pull the safety catch on your gun. Hail to Minneapolis, capital of anti-Semitism. And he goes on, the United States was founded of, by, and for the people of European Caucasian descent only. Mr. Mayor, if you oppose us and serve as the tool of the Jewish communist interests, we promise you here and now that on the day of judgment, our day of victory, you will meet your retribution. Gee, who's been talking about I am your retribution? I can't even guess. Anyway, that was the kind of letter that he'd been sending leading up to his attempt to assassinate Humphrey. And when the police go to his apartment, they find a German Luger, what else? Brass knuckles, knives, a map of World War III, correspondence with the white supremacists and anti-Semites called the Colombians in Georgia, who, if any of you have seen Driving Miss Daisy on stage or screen, or read Melissa Green's magisterial book, The Temple Bombing, you know that there is a Reformed temple that was bombed because its Rabbi Jack Rothschild was an ardent civil rights advocate. That bombing was done by the Colombians, who were Maynard Orlando Nelson's pen pals. And you even find there in his belongings something that I had not paid sufficient attention to at the time, but now having listened to season 2 of the Ultra podcast, realize the significance of, which were pamphlets put out post-World War II by pro-Nazi Americans saying that the Nuremberg trials had been unfair. So that's the man who clearly tried to assassinate Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey, for reasons I don't know for sure because I couldn't find a paper trail, chooses never to have charges pressed. I think he doesn't want Maynard Orlando Nelson to have a trial in which he can play the martyr, and I think he hopes that because of the other charges against him, he'll sort of slink away. And in point of fact, Maynard Orlando Nelson does slink away, and where he slinks to is Chicago, where he turns up in the 1960s as a member of George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. As for Hubert Humphrey, he goes on, based on his successful battles against anti-Semitism and racism in Minneapolis, to the national political stage. And that takes him to the 1948 Democratic Convention. And that's the convention where the fact that the Democrats are going to nominate Harry Truman is a given. There's no drama there. But the drama is about whether the Democratic Party, for the first time, will embrace civil rights. And Hubert Humphrey is Mr. Inside fighting that battle, and the great civil rights leader, A. Philip Randolph, is Mr. Outside leading protest marches fighting this battle. And the important thing to say here is that the civil rights plank that ultimately was carried explicitly called for those civil rights protections to be extended to every American on the basis of also religion and national origin as well as race. So that plank is immensely important to American Jews as well as American Catholics, as well as the minority groups that were most prevalent at that time, Chinese and Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans. So Humphrey's triumph in 1948 is correctly understood as a triumph for the civil rights of Black Americans, but it's insufficiently understood as also a moment of great triumph and inclusion for Jewish Americans. And it also sets up Hubert Humphrey for the better parts of his later public life. I'm going to close here, and I'm just going to close with this thought. Hubert Humphrey was often called the Happy Warrior. That's actually a moniker that first belonged to one of my other political heroes, Al Smith, And when people think about Happy Warrior, people who are critical of Humphrey focus on Happy, and I think, yeah, he was so corny, he was so trite, he was so out of touch with the traumas of America in the late 1960s. And people who admire Humphrey also just get stuck on the word happy, and they think he was buoyant and enthusiastic and energetic and made him such a great campaigner and such a great retail politician. But I've come to realize that when no one pays adequate attention to is the word warrior. And that's the other part of Humphrey, and it's the part that I want to end on tonight. Because that's the part of Humphrey that after he nearly lost his life because of the battles he was fighting with and for Jews and blacks in Minneapolis, he wasn't intimidated in the least. That next morning, when there was a police officer with a sawed-off shotgun sitting in a Windsor chair in the Humphrey living room, Hubert Humphrey got up, went to work, and fought the battles that he always fought, even more fiercely because they'd almost cost him his life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Freedman. That was an excellent, excellent lecture. We have a few minutes for questions, so if you have your note cards and you want to go ahead and write any quick questions down, Angela and Emily are going to pass through and pick those up, and you can pass them to the center aisle, and then I'll bring them forward to curate for Professor Freedman for a few questions we have time for. As we're waiting for that moment to happen, I do want to pose one question for you to get the conversation started. You drew the arc of the story to Hubert Humphrey's amazing work at the 48th Democratic National Convention that set the stage for this platform. What happened after that? Why did it seem to evaporate? We don't really hear again about any significant civil rights activity in the U.S.
Right, that's a great question. Well, you know, the 1948 convention, Harry Truman, who had wanted to avoid the civil rights issue, ends up with no choice but to run as a civil rights candidate. And he desegregates the military by executive order. He desegregates the federal workforce. The pivotal votes he gets in swing states, specifically Ohio, Illinois, and California, that let him defeat Tom Dewey, come from a surge in black voters. And Truman, and then with people like Humphrey and other liberals like Paul Douglas in the Senate, would want to move forward on civil rights, except that Truman's popularity immediately is declining after he takes office. He's facing a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern segregationist Democrats who can bottle up any civil rights legislation in committee, not even let it get to a vote. And that's why things are stalled. And for Humphrey individually, he does what he can personally. For instance, he desegregates the Senate dining room by bringing a black companion to lunch there. He becomes the first senator to hire a black staff member, a guy named Cyril King. But Humphrey, and we know this from Robert Cara's terrific books, is humiliated time and again by the Southern very senior senators, the segregationists, who will never forgive him for having pushed through the civil rights plank at the 48 convention. And then at the national level, both, Dwight Eisenhower in his 2 terms and John F. Kennedy for the 3 years that he's president are basically timid on civil rights. If they're absolutely forced to the wall by events like in Little Rock or after the church bombing in Birmingham, they'll start to do something, but it's not an issue that they want to spend political capital on. And so things remain, the promises of 1948 remain basically unfulfilled until 1963 when Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And Dr. Kaplan and I were over at the LBJ Library today reading on one of the didactics the text of the speech LBJ gives to Congress, his first as president, when he says, basically, my first priority is going to be pushing through the Civil Rights Bill, which Kennedy had introduced, but Kennedy would never have had either the political skill or, frankly, the moral commitment to have seen into law. It never would have happened, I'm convinced. And so when Johnson is president and he's willing to defy the Southerners, and Humphrey is one of his key senators, whipping votes, as they say, then finally they're able to not pass the law. Getting 51 votes to pass the Civil Rights Act was easy. The hard part was to cut off the filibuster, and you need 67 votes for that. And that's where you needed all of Johnson's guile and pressure and everything else, and Humphrey's help in the Senate to get up to 67 votes. So that's why it waits until 1964. But at that point, the power of the Southern segregationists has been broken. The experiment has been run, and the experiment is, could you pull enough votes together to end the filibuster? And once that's been done once, they know they can do it again, as will happen again with the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and so forth. But that's basically the reason for that 16-year latent period between 48 and 64. Well, Hubert Humphrey tried he ran for the Democratic nomination in 1960 and lost to John Kennedy. He of course ran in 1968, probably one of his lowest moments in terms of his enduring reputation, because he is running, having supported the Vietnam War along with Lyndon Johnson. He's basically handed the Democratic nomination at the Chicago Convention by the party machine. Admittedly after Robert Kennedy, who would have probably won it, had been assassinated. But nonetheless, Humphrey gets the nomination without ever really having competed for it. And literally, as he's giving his acceptance speech, the news cameras are cutting to scenes of Mayor Daley's police beating up anti-war protesters and journalists outside. So not a good look for the Humphrey campaign. And then in 1972, he ran as the establishment candidate for the Democratic nomination, losing it to George McGovern. And really at that point, he was fairly ill with cancer. He probably shouldn't have run. He ran in a sort of a frenetic, panicked way that was really him at his worst, and led Hunter S. Thompson, the self-proclaimed gonzo journalist, to write in Rolling Stone that Humphrey was campaigning, quote, like a rat in heat. And so Humphrey's presidential races didn't serve his legacy well. But one thing I will say in his defense is that the last big effort he made in public life in the Senate in the mid-1970s was to push through a full employment law. It's called the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. And this was really his great effort to carry on the legacy of the New Deal and the Great Society. And it was watered down because Jimmy Carter didn't like it. It was watered down because conservatives in the Senate didn't like it. And it was passed almost as an honorific to Humphrey, but in such a pallid form as to be meaningless. But really, at the very end of his life, Humphrey was fighting his last battles for an inclusive kind of economic equality.
So just one more question for us tonight, and certainly there'll be an opportunity to some more refreshments people can take afterwards to interact one-on-one. But I wanted to pose the question to you: to what extent did Hubert Humphrey continue to influence the Midwest and the shape of politics there, even though he was very much a short-termer in local politics, one term as mayor and jumping straight to the Senate, versus his kind of move to national politics?
Well, but even when he was in national politics, he was a senator from the state of Minnesota from 1948 to 1964, and then again from 1970 until his death in 1977, and he stayed extremely connected to the state. And he probably retained a bit more popularity in Minnesota than he did with other liberal voters in other parts of the country. And I think he's part of a continuum of Minnesota liberalism that is carried on by people like Paul Wellstone and Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar and Tim Walz. And a lot of those people also managed what Humphrey managed, which was to take the best elements of economic egalitarianism and communitarian spirit out of what was called prairie populism, but never to have any truck with the dark side of prairie populism, which was nativism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment. And also to become a very skillful urban politician. In Humphrey's time, that meant getting to know Jewish and black communities, understanding the issues that were important to them. And for someone, in Tim Walz's time, it means being governor of a state, even though he's come out of a very rural background and a very rural congressional district, becoming governor of a state with big Hmong communities and big Somali communities and big Ethiopian communities and big Mexican community. So I think it's also the ability to straddle both rural and small town issues, but also urban issues. People really, when Walz was put on the ticket, I kind of rolled my eyes. Even a lot of the admiring articles about him sort of exoticized him and made it seem like he's a hayseed who's the governor of a whole state of hayseeds. And I thought, well, you just don't know how fast the demography of Minnesota has changed and what a governor there needed to do to keep up with it. And I think all of this is very much in the spirit of Humphrey. And even when at the Democratic Convention there was a lot of talk about the politics of joy, that was a phrase Humphrey used at absolutely the wrong time. When he announced his run for president in 1968, he used the phrase the politics of joy. This is a couple weeks after Martin Luther King has been assassinated and after Lyndon Johnson said he won't run again. And the death toll in Vietnam is one of its highest points on a week-by-week basis. No one wanted to know from the politics of joy at that moment. But in a weird way, when his term got recycled this year, it felt like the right use of it. So he may be getting a bit of rhetorical redemption now.